The reception was winding down, the once vibrant energy of the night giving way to a softer, more subdued atmosphere. The dance floor, now littered with confetti and discarded champagne flutes, had lost its earlier magic. Most of the guests had already left, their laughter and congratulations fading into the crisp evening air. But I stayed, nursing the last of my drink at a corner table, unable to tear my eyes away from her. Claire, the bride. She was breathtaking tonight, more than I'd ever seen her before. The way the fabric of her white gown caught the light, the way her laughter carried over the room like a melody, it was impossible not to look at her. She was the kind of woman who could make you forget everything else in the world when she smiled, and tonight, that smile was brighter than ever. She twirled on the dance floor with her new husband, her movements effortless and full of joy. He looked at her like she hung the moon, and she beamed back at him, the picture of perfection. A perfect couple. A perfect night. At least, that's how it should have been. But something about the way she moved, the way her eyes darted around the room when she thought no one was looking, felt off. It was subtle, barely noticeable to anyone who didn't know her the way I did. The brief flicker of hesitation in her gaze, the way her smile faltered ever so slightly when she caught my eye across the room. She was happy. She looked happy. But there was something else there, something she was trying to bury beneath the laughter and champagne. I tried to brush it off, to convince myself I was imagining things. After all, this was her wedding day, the day she'd been dreaming of for as long as I could remember. I should have been focused on celebrating her, on toasting to her happiness. But that lingering feeling, that gnawing sense that something wasn't right, refused to let me go. And then she made her way toward me. She moved through the room with her usual grace, her cheeks flushed from dancing, strands of hair slipping loose from her updo in a way that only made her more beautiful. I thought she was coming over to thank me for being here, to share one last laugh before the night was over. But when she reached my table, her hand found mine, and the look in her eyes stopped me cold. "Claire?" I asked, my voice tinged with concern. She didn't answer right away. Her fingers tightened around mine, trembling slightly. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice low, trembling just enough to make my stomach twist. I stared at her, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't the radiant, confident Claire who'd owned the dance floor moments ago. This was something else entirely. "Okay," I said carefully, standing as she tugged me toward a side door. "What's going on?" She didn't respond. Her grip on my hand was firm, almost desperate, as she led me out of the reception hall and into a quieter part of the venue. My pulse quickened with every step, my mind racing with possibilities. We stopped in a small room off the main hall, the muffled sounds of the reception fading behind the heavy door as it clicked shut. The space was dimly lit, cozy in a way that felt at odds with the tension that hung between us. She let go of my hand and began pacing, clutching the skirts of her gown as if they were the only thing grounding her. Her breath came in short, uneven bursts, and I could see the faint shimmer of tears forming in her eyes. "Claire," I said cautiously, taking a step closer. "Talk to me. What's going on?" She stopped pacing, turning to face me with a look that made my chest tighten. Her eyes were shining, filled with something between desperation and fear, and her lips parted as if she was trying to find the words but couldn't. She started, her voice barely above a whisper. I waited, holding my breath, as the seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity. "I can't keep this from you anymore," she said finally, her voice breaking. The weight of her words settled over me like a lead blanket, and my mind raced to fill in the gaps. Was she unhappy? Was there something wrong with the marriage already? "Claire," I said again, more firmly this time. "Whatever it is, just tell me." She took a shaky breath, her hands trembling as they reached for mine. The contact sent a jolt through me, her grip warm but unsteady. "I made a mistake," she confessed, her voice cracking as tears spilled over her cheeks. My heart sank. "What kind of mistake?" I asked, my throat tightening around the question. She looked at me then, her eyes searching mine, and I could see the battle raging inside her. Whatever she was about to say, it was something she'd been holding on to for a long time. "I should have told you sooner," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. But I couldn't. I didn't know how. The room felt impossibly small, the air heavy with the weight of her confession. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. All I could do was wait, my heart pounding, as Claire stood before me, her tears falling harder now, her hands gripping mine like she was afraid I'd slip away. We ended up in a small, quiet room off the main hall, the kind of space meant for staff or storage, its muted decor a stark contrast to the glittering reception. The heavy door closed behind us with a soft click, shutting out the distant hum of laughter, music, and clinking glasses. The sudden quiet was almost suffocating, amplifying the sound of Claire's breathing as she paced in front of me. Her hands clutched the flowing skirts of her wedding dress, the fabric twisting in her grip as if she needed something to hold onto to keep from falling apart. Her breath came fast, shallow, and uneven, and I could see the rise and fall of her chest beneath the intricate lace bodice. "Claire," I said cautiously, my voice breaking the silence. I took a step toward her, unsure if she wanted comfort or space. "What's going on?" She stopped pacing at the sound of my voice, turning to face me with an expression that made my stomach twist. Her eyes were shining, brimming with unshed tears, and her lips trembled as she tried to form words. There was something raw and vulnerable in her gaze, something that stripped away the confident, radiant bride I'd watched twirl across the dance floor. She started, her voice barely above a whisper, but then she hesitated, her eyes darting away as if she couldn't bear to look at me. "Claire, talk to me," I urged, stepping closer. "Whatever it is, you can tell me." Her hands dropped to her sides, and she exhaled shakily, as if the act of speaking was physically painful. "I can't keep this from you anymore," she said finally, her voice trembling. The weight of her words settled over me like a lead blanket, and my mind raced with possibilities. Was she unhappy? Was there something wrong with her marriage already? "You're scaring me," I said, my voice softer now. "What's going on?" She turned her back to me, her shoulders heaving slightly as she tried to compose herself. The silence stretched between us, heavy and charged, and I felt like the walls of the small room were closing in. Finally, she spoke again, her voice cracking. "I made a mistake." My heart sank at the admission, dread pooling in my stomach. "What kind of mistake?" I asked, the words catching in my throat. Claire turned back to me, and the sight of her nearly broke me. Tears streaked her flushed cheeks, her makeup smudging slightly as she swiped at her face with trembling hands. She looked fragile in a way I'd never seen before, like the weight of whatever she was carrying was too much to bear. "I should have told you sooner," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But I didn't know how." Her words sent my mind spiraling further, every scenario more dire than the last. Did something happen between her and her husband? Was there something she'd done, something she regretted? "Tell me what?" I asked, my voice firmer now, though my hands were trembling at my sides. Claire stepped closer, her hands reaching out to clasp mine. Her grip was warm but unsteady, her fingers curling around mine as if she was afraid I'd pull away. "I didn't know how to tell you," she said again, her tears spilling over now, streaking her flawless bridal glow with a rawness that cut straight through me. "I thought I could bury it, that I could just move on. But I can't. I can't keep pretending like everything's fine." "Claire," I said, barely above a whisper, the urgency in her voice tying my chest in knots. "Whatever it is, just say it." Her lips parted, and for a moment, I thought she might falter again. But then she took a deep breath, her hands tightening around mine as she met my gaze, her eyes filled with an emotion so intense it left me breathless. "I've been lying to myself," she said, her voice breaking. "And to you." The words hung between us like a storm cloud, heavy and electric, and I could feel the air shift as she finally said the thing she'd been holding back. "I've been in love with you," she whispered, her voice trembling as the tears came harder now. "For years." The room spun. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a moment, I forgot how to breathe. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but stare at her, my mind reeling as her confession shattered the air between us. "I tried to let it go," she continued, her voice thick with desperation. "I thought marrying him would fix it, that it would make these feelings go away. But it didn't. And I couldn't keep pretending, not tonight. Not when I saw you sitting there, looking at me like that." Her words broke something open inside me, a flood of emotions I couldn't name crashing over me all at once. Anger, confusion, sadness, and something else, something that felt like longing, swirled together, leaving me too overwhelmed to speak. "Why didn't you tell me?" I managed finally, my voice hoarse. "Why now?" "Because I was scared," she admitted, her voice cracking. "Scared of losing you. Scared of ruining everything we had. And then you were so supportive of him and me, and I thought maybe you didn't feel the same." The desperation in her voice, the way her tears fell harder with every word, made my heart ache in ways I didn't understand. "Claire," I said, her name coming out as a whisper, a plea. She squeezed my hands, her grip tightening as she searched my face for something, an answer, a sign, anything. I needed you to know, she said, her voice breaking on the last word. The weight of her confession settled heavily in the space between us, and I realized there was no going back. I stared at her, the world around me spinning in slow, dizzying circles. The weight of her words crashed into me like a tidal wave, leaving me gasping for air. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out the muffled sounds of the reception beyond the door. "Claire, you're scaring me," I managed, though my voice felt foreign, trembling with a mix of confusion and fear. "What's going on?" Her chest rose and fell with each shaky breath, her tears streaking the delicate makeup that had been flawless just moments ago. She looked at me, her eyes shining with raw emotion, and I could see the struggle written all over her face. Whatever she was about to say, it was breaking her apart. And then she said it. "I'm in love with you." For a moment the room tilted, the floor shifting beneath me as her words hung in the air like a live wire, sparking and impossible to ignore. "What?" I whispered, the single syllable barely escaping my lips. "I've been in love with you for years," she continued, her voice breaking as she wiped at her cheeks with trembling hands. "Even before I met him." The confession hit me like a punch to the gut. My lungs felt like they'd forgotten how to work, and the room seemed to close in around me. She stepped closer, her hands reaching out as if to steady herself, or me. "I thought," her voice cracked, and she took a moment to compose herself. "I thought marrying him would make it go away. That if I built a life with him, I could bury how I feel about you. But it didn't. It hasn't." Her words hung heavy in the air, the silence between us thick and suffocating. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stare at her as her confession shattered every boundary I thought existed between us. "Why didn't you tell me?" I whispered finally, my voice raw with a mix of confusion, anger, and something I couldn't quite name. "Because I was scared," she cried, her voice rising in desperation. She took another step toward me, her hands trembling as she reached for mine. "I was scared of ruining everything, of losing you. You're my best friend. I didn't know what to do with these feelings, and I thought if I ignored them long enough, they'd just disappear." Her grip tightened on my hands, her touch warm but unsteady, and I felt trapped in the intensity of her gaze. "But then you were so supportive of me and him," she continued, her voice cracking as fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "You were there every step of the way, cheering us on, helping me plan this day. And I thought maybe you didn't feel the same. That maybe I was just imagining things." Her words struck a chord deep inside me, stirring memories I'd buried long ago. Moments when her touch lingered just a little too long, when her laugh made my heart skip in a way I'd chalked up to friendship. All the late-night conversations, the quiet glances that had seemed to hold something unspoken between us, came rushing back with painful clarity. I pulled my hands away, the gesture more instinctive than intentional, and her face crumpled at the loss of contact. "Claire, this is—" I trailed off, searching for the right words, but nothing came. How could I possibly put this storm of emotions into words? "I know," she said quickly, her voice trembling. "I know it's too much, and I shouldn't have said anything, but I couldn't hold it in anymore. Not tonight. Not when I saw you sitting there, looking at me like that." "Like what?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "Like you were waiting for me to say something," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Like you knew." The truth was, maybe I had known. Maybe some part of me had always known, but was too afraid to acknowledge it. But now that the truth was out in the open, it felt like it was tearing me apart. "This changes everything, Claire," I said finally, my voice heavy with the weight of her confession. "I know," she whispered, her tears falling faster now. "I know it does. But I couldn't keep pretending. Not anymore." She reached for me again, her fingers brushing mine in a gesture so small, so tentative, it broke my heart. "Please," she said, her voice shaking. "Just tell me if there's even a chance. If you've ever felt the same." Her question hung between us, raw and inescapable, and I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, the ground crumbling beneath my feet. I looked at her, at the woman who had been my best friend for so many years, who had stood beside me through everything, and my chest ached with the weight of what I couldn't say. "I don't know," I said finally, the words spilling out in a rush. "I don't know what I feel, Claire. It's too much." Her face fell, her eyes filling with a pain so deep it made my stomach twist. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. I needed you to know. I couldn't keep it in anymore." The room was silent again, save for the sound of her quiet sobs, and I felt like the air had been stolen from my lungs. The enormity of her confession, of what it meant for both of us, loomed over me, and I didn't know how to move forward. I sank into the nearest chair, my legs no longer able to support the weight of everything that had just happened. My chest felt tight, and my breath came in shallow bursts as I struggled to process her words. Claire knelt in front of me, her wedding gown pooling around her like a sea of white, her trembling hands clutching mine as though I might slip away if she let go. "Do you?" she asked, her voice breaking, her tear-streaked face filled with equal parts desperation and hope. "Do you feel the same?" The question hit me like a knife, raw and sharp, cutting through every barrier I had so carefully built. The room seemed to shrink around us, the air heavy with the unspoken feelings that had been dragged into the light. Did I? Could I? I thought back to all the years we'd been friends, to the countless moments that suddenly took on a new weight. The times her touch lingered on my arm, just a second too long. The way her laugh had always seemed to reach a part of me no one else could. The nights we stayed up talking until dawn, sharing secrets we hadn't told anyone else. Had I missed something? Or had I ignored it on purpose? Her hands tightened around mine, pulling me back to the present. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Just tell me. I need to know." Claire, her name caught in my throat, the syllable heavy with everything I couldn't say. My chest ached as I looked at her, at the woman who had been my constant for so many years. The woman who had just promised her life to someone else. "You're married now," I said finally, my voice low and heavy with the weight of the truth. "You made a choice." She flinched at my words, the hope in her eyes dimming as her tears fell harder. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know I did. But I couldn't. I couldn't keep this from you anymore." Her hands slipped from mine as she pulled back slightly, her shoulders sagging under the weight of her confession. "Do you know how hard it's been? Watching you, being close to you, and pretending that I didn't feel this way?" I didn't respond. I couldn't. My mind was a storm, every emotion clashing with the next. Guilt, confusion, anger, and something deeper, something I didn't dare name. "I thought marrying him would make it go away," she continued, her voice thick with tears. "I thought it would fix everything, that I could bury how I feel about you and build a life with him. But it didn't. It just made it worse." Her words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, and I felt like I was drowning in everything she had laid at my feet. "Why now?" I asked finally, my voice hoarse. "Why would you tell me this now, on your wedding night?" She looked at me, her face crumpling as fresh tears spilled over. "Because I couldn't stand it anymore. Seeing you there tonight, sitting alone, looking at me like that." She trailed off, her voice breaking. "Like what?" I pressed, though my chest tightened at the thought of hearing her answer. "Like you were waiting for me to say something," she whispered. "Like you knew." The truth was, maybe I had. Maybe some part of me had always known, buried deep beneath layers of denial and fear. But hearing her say it, seeing the raw pain in her eyes, made it impossible to ignore. We sat in silence, the weight of her confession pressing down on both of us like a physical force. My hands fidgeted in my lap, her tears falling unchecked as she stared at the floor. Finally, she stood, her movements slow and heavy, like the effort cost her everything she had left. She wiped her eyes with trembling fingers, smearing her makeup further, but she didn't seem to care. When she looked at me, her expression was one I would never forget, longing, regret, and a love that had no place in the life she'd chosen. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. I had to tell you. I wanted to say something, to reach out, to fix the shattered pieces of whatever this was between us. But I couldn't move, couldn't speak. All I could do was watch as she turned and walked toward the door. Her gown trailed behind her, the sound of the fabric whispering against the floor the only noise in the room. When she reached the door, she paused, her hand on the handle, her shoulders rising and falling with a shaky breath. Then she was gone, the door clicking softly shut behind her. I sat there, staring at the space where she had just been, my heart heavier than it had ever been before. Her words echoed in my mind, each one carving into me with a precision that left no part of me untouched. As the distant sounds of the reception filtered back into the quiet room, I felt the weight of her absence settle over me like a shadow. I didn't know what to do, what to think, or how to move forward from here. All I knew was that nothing would ever be the same.